everyone see the slides? Great.
Yeah.
My job is done. So hello, everyone. Really pleased to be here. I'm Kerry Perkins. I head up our capital markets work within Accounting for Sustainability, also known as A4S. And in my role, I have a lot of conversations with trustees and others within the market on the challenges there are and the possible steps and practical actions that can be taken. As Karen said, really pleased to be here and being joined by Tegs and Doug. And after a while, I'm going to talk to them about the challenges that they face and how they are overcoming them. So just quickly, for those who may not have heard of A4S before, we were founded by His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales in 2004, and our remit is around transforming finance to deliver a sustainable future. So we work across the entire financial community to drive a fundamental shift towards resilient business models. And we inspire, so finance leaders to take action. We transform with the financial decision making to enable an integrated approach. So we do this through, for example, our A4S Essential Guide series and case studies. And then we scale up action globally via training, for example, our A4S Academy partnerships and also peer-to-peer engagement. And we work across the entire end-to-end finance system, mainly working with at the most senior level. And then within the capital markets work and with pensions in particular, I run our asset owners network, and this is made up of chairs of pension fund. We've got around 30, predominantly the UK, and we provide them a safe space to come together and explore the challenges and their specific role on ESG integration. And as part of that, we launched in December 2020 our ESG toolkit for pension chairs and trustees. And this is designed specifically for trustees and provides tools, case studies and guidance to support them skill up their knowledge and confidence in this area. And so I've been asked to offer a few reflections on COP26 and expected trends for 2022. Now, I can see there are a few people on the call today who are very much in the thick of developments and much more qualified than I, so please do add your insights to this, maybe when we get to the breakouts. But for me, COP26 was neither a failure nor a brilliant success, with a 1.5 degrees Celsius future still feasible, but on life support. There were some significant steps taken, and just to summarise, on momentum. So it revived the momentum that had become, I would say, fragmented since the Paris Agreement in 2050. And if anything, it increased it, with the narrative being stronger than ever before. So this is narrative not only from world leaders, but also now from business leaders, from NGOs, and of course from our communities. Then we have the climate aligned finance commitment. So there was a massive surge before and during COP for climate aligned finance commitments from the financial sector. And this culminated with the 130 trillion US dollars of assets committing to this at COP. Another key development was the IFRS's International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, that was created to produce a comprehensive global sustainability disclosure standards, which paves the way for a more consistent approach to help investors. And A4S has been closely connected to this due to our long work in this area. Then with the bilateral agreements this year, or this COP, the voluntary bilateral agreements that took place outside of the formal negotiations included some significant ones, including methane and deforestation pledges. And then with the formal negotiations and the Glasgow Climate Pact, on the positive, we saw the first ever mention of coal in a COP agreement, a requirement to revisit and re-strengthen the 2030 targets by the end of this year, which is quite significant, bringing it forward from what was originally the 2025 marker. And then there was a doubling of adaptation funding, which is a start. However, the tension between emerging and developing countries and developed countries was highly present. the loss and damage compensation to vulnerable countries. While this was acknowledged officially for the first time, which was a great step, there were no pledges to financial compensation. There was also a significant last-minute change, which I'm sure you're all aware of, from phase out to phase down of unabated coal, which was disappointing. Some key trends that we can expect, in my opinion. So last year was the year of headline commitments, and it's very much about the details and action now. So the year of headline commitments only is over. Entities will be expected to put in the detail on how to achieve interim targets by 2030, as well as building up those initial commitments, such as growing the portfolio coverage to align with net zero goals. Then, while portfolio net zero alignment is a critical first step, there is an expectation and a need for financial institutions to proactively finance the real economy transformations. And this in mind, it could possibly be a record-breaking year for the launch of new green investment products, green bonds, sustainability-linked loans to help with this. And of course, stewardship and active ownership will play a very key role here. I'm sure all of you are aware of the just transition terminology, or in other words, where a transition to avoid the most catastrophic effects of climate change is fair for everyone. So that's considering the environmental, but also the economical and the social perspective. Now, while a lot needs to be driven from governments on policy here, asset owners can play a significant supportive role. And a simple first step would be to familiarise yourself with some of the initiatives that are starting to appear, and we can expect a lot more to appear on this as well. So, for example, the Scottish Government's Just Transition Commission, there's regional ones in Yorkshire and Humber, for example, and then we have like-minded institutions who have started to really embed the consideration of just transition into their work. So the World Benchmarking Alliance has undertaken just transition assessments of companies. Climate 100 Plus has now got a disclosure indicator on just transition. And then for those that would be interested and relevant, the All-Party Parliamentary Group sessions on just transition, I believe there's one early March for local authority pension funds. Then more focus on adaptation, i.e. making...
Kerry, we can see your reminders coming up.
Oh, yes.
Blocking the slide view.
Yeah, and now I need to work backwards. Sorry, thank you. Okay. So yes, so this is adaptation, i.e. making changes to live with the impacts of climate change. This has to date really been overshadowed by a focus on mitigation, i.e. the reducing of GHG emissions or enhancing the greenhouse gas, the sinks of greenhouse gases. But with some signals from COP26, I mentioned the doubling of adaptation financing, and also this year's COP27 in Egypt, where the climate vulnerabilities really facing the communities across Africa will be on full display. There will be more and more focus put on adaptation and the financing of it. The regulatory landscape, obviously this will continue to evolve rapidly, and that's evidenced very much in this country with several recent, current or upcoming consultations taking place, including the net zero transition plans and the government's indication at COP26 to make this mandatory. And then there's others like the portfolio alignment metrics and forward-looking climate metrics. And of course, TCFD related requirements, which you may already be involved in or getting ready for soon. Then continued rise in people-led movements. So through pension member demand, campaigns like Make My Money Matter and platforms like Tumelo, supporting the member voice, we can expect that to continue. And then finally, I just wanted to add about regenerative economy. So going beyond climate to include nature and people and really understanding the interconnectedness between all three. I can anticipate this will include building awareness on the impact this year much, much more. Trying to grapple with what the multiple tipping points could be and how this interconnects with climate change. Of course, we have the COP15 Convention on Biological Diversity taking place this year, amongst other key environmental meetings. And then just briefly before I introduce or welcome Ted and Teg, not Ted, Teg, and I think that was an amalgamation of your two names together, Teg and Doug together, we just wanted to quickly talk about some top tips for pension schemes. So we, this is not a comprehensive list clearly, but some key top tips that we have identified through our ongoing conversations with the trustee and the wider pension community. So looking at getting started, so understanding where you are at and get key decision makers on the same page. So I mentioned earlier our ESG toolkit for pension chairs and trustees. So one element of this is a maturity map. And I know the people like Marcus, who's on this call, has very much used this. So we have encouraged chairs and trustees to workshop this maturity match, which is very much mapping out what good looks like across a maturity journey with their board to really develop a consensus about where the priorities need to be. Some of our trustees have already come back to say it's really helped them focus, and some have even said, you know, put them back in the driving seat. So I think it's quite a easy process to do, and it kind of helps you prioritize where you want to focus. Leveraging your peer networks and joining existing collaborations. So this is really great to get practical ideas that have already been road tested to address similar challenges you are facing. So contact your peers. You can even look at our bank of case studies on our website to get an idea about which pension schemes have done some great work in particular areas. And then there's obviously key platforms like the Occupational Pension Stewardship Council, the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, PRI, Transitions Pathway Initiative. And then obviously, if you are a chair, would like to recommend your chair to join our Asset Owners Network. And then one thing that's come up a lot with our conversations with trustees is using established process and not feeling that you need to start from the beginning on this. So use the TCFD framework and scenario modeling to help understand your exposure to climate risk and identifying those targets and metrics for net zero. Test out different asset class approaches, for example, with the IIGCC's net zero investment framework. And then also you can look at embedding objectives and milestones into your established internal processes, like your investment beliefs and mandates. Then leveraging your position to embed ESG factors into the investment process. So looking at how you can go above and beyond the regulatory requirements. So introducing set criteria to the manager procurement process. So evidence of you could ask for evidence of the candidates, so the manager candidate's own TCFD implementation, their net zero pathway, you know, are they a signatory to the UK Stewardship Code, etc. And you can ask your investment consultants to factor in these criteria, so the asset manager's ESG policy, implementation outcomes, etc., into their selection process for you. Then setting up investment mandates, so placing value on the long-termism and demanding long-term metrics from asset managers and underlying assets. So again, enlist your consultant to help to do this. And then embracing the power of stewardship. So good stewardship is essential and enables the asset owner to make a real impact in reducing the real economy's contribution to climate change. And there's some great examples out there. So you could look at our bank of case studies, and go via the Occupational Pension Stewardship Council. And then if you haven't yet, I would encourage you to read up on the findings of the task force on pension scheme voting implementation, on how pension schemes can have a more vocal say or louder say in voting. And then finally, get active. So recognizing the influential role you can play with the shareholder resolution process, for example. So I was speaking to the chair of a corporate board recently on a previous resolution that took place last year. And they spoke about the significant impact of having the asset owner as a co-filer. Or in their own words, they said they sat up and listened. and collaborating with others is the best way to do this. And a good examples of this can be found last year, for example, the 2021 Barclays resolution, with Brunel Pension Scheme being a co-filer of that. And then other ways: getting active, respond to the policy consultations and make recommendations to policy makers, get involved in that development, and then participating in collective initiatives, as I mentioned earlier. And then just as a parting message on this would be that the more proactive you can be and anticipate what will happen, especially around regulation, then the more of a firm footing I feel you will have when regulation and changes do pass. Okay, that was a whistle-stop tour, and hopefully we're still on time. I'm going to invite Tegs and Doug now into the conversation. So I'm going to get out of this. Okay. And okay, so Tegs, I'm just going to ask a couple of questions for you now. So you, Tegs, you are on a couple of schemes, or quite a few schemes. Would you be able to kind of compare and contrast the steps that the different schemes are taking to embed ESG considerations into the decisions that are made?
Yeah, absolutely. So I work with a range of different schemes, both DB, DC, some master trusts as well. And it's fair to say that everybody is in a slightly different stage of that journey. You know, it's no surprise that the bigger schemes are going first, they have to. But you're also getting differences coming through depending on how keen the sponsor is on sustainability. At the larger end, then the kind of the process people are going with is everybody needs to start with that bit of education. Why is it important? What could it do to our portfolio? And I think that in most boards' minds quickly establishes that this is a huge and complicated subject, and you're going to need some sort of governance framework around it, so that the bigger schemes I'm working with typically are then putting in place a ESG or sustainability subcommittee to kind of take forward the actions and develop policy. The next stage is then really sort of formulating that policy alongside the sponsor. Now, again, bigger schemes have better access to that sponsor. And even where smaller schemes do have regular contact with their sponsor and input, companies just care more about it when the pension scheme is quite a big pot of money. That's natural. So there tends to be a lot more company input on what that policy should look like at the larger end of the scheme. Once you've got that policy, the first step is then sort of seeing how you stack up against it, seeing how the current portfolio stacks up. And from there, you can identify your key priorities of what it is that you're going to do to try and engage with your managers better. How does your asset allocation need to change? This is probably another area that differs between the big schemes and small schemes. Bigger schemes have much more capacity to focus on the opportunities, not just the risks. So going back to that sort of being that proactive approach you were talking about, Kerry, in my experience, that is limited to the large schemes at the moment for practical reasons. Just the size of the capital that they can allocate, the ability to allocate across private markets, which is where a lot of those opportunities are, certainly at the moment. And then you're kind of into the next stage of the process of engaging with those managers. Again, when you're a big scheme, you have segregated mandates and you can write the rules on those mandates and set specific targets, which at the smaller end, you don't have the opportunity to do. Once you're kind of moving through those steps, you've moved through all of your portfolio, you're really into how do we make sure at a high level we're still moving forward in the right direction. So you're designing your reporting framework, what you're going to do over the next 12 months, how as a board you're going to be held to account that you're hitting the targets that you set, and sort of feeding that back into the company. Once you're there, you're starting to think about then how are we going to hold ourselves accountable to members as well? So how are we going to communicate all the good work that we're doing? And again, those sorts of considerations are much more at the larger end of the scale rather than the small one, just simply because of bandwidth. I think on policy, that the last sort of contrast that I would draw out is around targets. When you have segregated mandates, you have the ability to really engage with the manager to set targets that make sense on an asset class by asset class basis. You know, we all know the limitations around data. If you set net zero targets on quite a narrow definition of emissions alone, you might not always get the outcome that you actually want in terms of that real world reduction in emissions. Whereas you get to a much more sort of sensible and balanced place if you had a suite of those metrics covering things like emissions, but also the asset manager's own opinion of what each company's doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And then just adding to that, then drawing on for those that are smaller schemes, what would you say some of the, in addition to what you've just said, some of the steps that they could be taking to proactively prepare in areas that might not be as obvious if you weren't a large organisation?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do have some small schemes that are taking steps in this area. So they're defined benefit schemes in the sort of tens of millions, so not huge by any stretch. And they're going through some of the same early stages, so that process of education and then thinking about where they'd like to set their policy. I think what they're not able to do is really have a kind of separate committee just looking at these things. So they really do have to prioritize more, and that drives them to looking for the low-hanging fruit, which is typically in their equity portfolios still. So looking for alternative ways to invest a bit more sustainably using some of the sustainable indices that are now coming out.
Okay, thanks Tegs. And then Doug, bringing you in, so you represent both trustee of a pooled pension fund and member of the pooling partner Border to Coast. So in recognising the specific challenges that pooled funds face, for example, little influence over the fund manager selection process, can you tell us from your personal experience about what trustees of pooled funds can do to help shape an ESG approach?
Yeah, thanks, Kerry. It's a great question. First, I might say, of course, we're a public pension scheme, so it's not that different, but there are some little tweaks in it. First point I'll make is I'm going to have to assume that the pension fund has actually established its own beliefs, so those being investment beliefs, and that is really important. And then the fund must stick to its beliefs, but importantly, it must articulate these robustly with all stakeholders and through all different channels. And that can be upwards and indeed downwards. And I mean that by through the investment managers and or the fund members. This will result in the development and indeed the review of the investment strategy. And then that will help inform how you'll allocate capital. So in terms of the asset allocation, to include your appetite for risk and determine the return required net of fees. And I really do ask people that are chairing pension funds not to get hung up on the manager selection. What you must do is make sure that you communicate effectively your expectations of the pool company to include the beliefs, the investment needs in terms of the risk versus return net of fees. You then manage robustly and hold to account and monitor the pool accordingly. And just make sure that all your expectations are well described.
And just, Doug, I mentioned earlier about the just transition. So how do you feel that both the Bedford Pension Fund and the Border to Coast are ensuring that in addressing the net zero transition, that the social and economic implications are also included and considered? Not an easy one, I know.
No, not an easy, but something I am personally passionate about, and I just dropped in the chat the publication that came out of the APPG. But at Bedfordshire as the fund, we're increasingly looking how to reduce the exposure to a carbon footprint through the appropriate deployment of capital. Thereafter, it's done in two ways. First of all, engaging with investee companies. And secondly, looking to move from existing investment vehicles to other products that are better aligned to our climate agenda. Importantly, in this context, it should be in a fair and just transition, minimising negative impacts on communities and the environment, and I say people and planet. And this has to be seen through the whole investment chain to include in this discussion the pool company in our case. So it's just recognising it. And I will say, and I would say, that border to coast are entrenched in E, S and G.
Okay. And I'm conscious that we're running a little bit over, and so apologies, Karen, for that. So I just wanted to ask one key question to you both, Tegs and Doug, on and you've implied a couple of them, but any top tips that you would give peers on tangible steps that they can take in and above what you've already said? Is there anything else you would say? Tegs, can I start with you?
I think I can't stress the governance point enough. This is a huge subject. It needs thinking about really carefully. And if you can get a subcommittee identifying those key actions, making sure you're getting the right advice, it definitely goes a lot smoother.
And then just on that, Tegs, for those small companies where they can't get the additional committees, what have you done instead?
Well, there's a lot of free resources that you're talking about already, Kerry. The maturity map is absolutely brilliant. It also reduces the reliance on investment consultants, which, you know, while they are brilliant, they aren't free. So for those smaller schemes, you know, there is that resource out there that you can use to drive those decisions forward.
Yeah, thanks, and I'll pay you later for that comment. And Doug, over to you. Any last top tips?
Yeah, well, I think I would have to support Tegs's comment around governance without a doubt. I do actually come back to the investment beliefs. Bedfordshire Pension Fund took time out in 2020 to discuss what our investment beliefs were. That's helped us form our direction of travel. And I think I'll just finally say, you know, stay strong in your conviction, but do try and be creative in thinking how to best achieve all that's been said. Because if we just put up too often, and I'm guilty of this, don't just always throw in, and I've avoided saying it thus far, the fiduciary duty. We cannot hide behind that. You know, we've got to be forward thinking.
Okay, thank you both. And I will swiftly move back to Karen before she